There's a palm tree in the Seychelles that takes 30 years to make a single seed. That seed can weigh as much as a grown man's leg. There's a fruit in Brazil that doesn't grow on branches. It grows straight out of the bark, like the tree is wearing a coat of grapes. And there's a fruit that was illegal to bring into the United States for most of modern history. Not because of what's inside it, because of what might be hiding in the rind. Most professional growers, people who've spent their whole lives working soil, have never touched any of these. Today, we're covering 20 of them: how they grow, why they're almost impossible to find, and what happens if you actually get your hands on one. Coco de Mer. This is the biggest seed on the planet. A single Coco de Mer seed can weigh up to 30 kilograms, over 60 pounds, and measure nearly half a meter across. It grows on one palm species, Lotosea maldivica, native to exactly 2 islands in the Seychelles. Here's why almost no farmer anywhere has ever grown one. The seed takes 6 to 7 years just to sprout, then another 25 to 50 years before the tree produces fruit. Some of these trees live for centuries. For most of history, nobody knew where Coco de Mer seeds came from. Sailors found them washed up on beaches as far away as the Maldives and assumed they grew on a tree at the bottom of the ocean. That's where the name comes from, coconut of the sea. The actual source wasn't confirmed until 1768. Today it's protected by Seychelles law. You can't legally export a whole viable seed, only a hollowed out husk with a numbered government permit. This is a wonder that will almost certainly outlive most of the people watching this video. Jabuticaba, this is one of the weirdest things a fruit tree can do. Most fruit grows at the tips of branches. Jabuticaba grows straight out of the bark, trunk, main limbs, even old wood. Botanists call this cauliflory. It's so rare, Jabuticaba is the poster child every time the topic comes up. Native to Brazil, the tree can flower and fruit 5 or 6 times a year in the right climate. The fruit looks like a dark grape, tastes like a sweet tart burst of jelly. But here's the catch. Jabuticaba starts fermenting within 3 to 4 days of being picked. That's why you'll never see it in a grocery store outside South America. If you want to taste one, you have to be standing under the tree. Mangosteen. This fruit has a criminal record. The USDA banned fresh mangosteen imports into the United States for decades. Not because it's toxic, because the thick rind was suspected of harboring the Asian fruit fly, a pest that hit Hawaii in the 1940s and caused serious agricultural damage. The ban wasn't lifted until 2007. Even now, mangosteen imported from Southeast Asia has to be irradiated before it enters the country. And the tree itself doesn't make it easy. It takes 10 to 15 years to bear its first fruit, and it doesn't transplant well because of a fragile taproot. Put those two things together, decades of import restrictions plus a genuinely difficult tree, and you get why a single mangosteen can cost several dollars in an American specialty market, in a country where it grows almost nowhere. If a fruit having its own legal history sounds crazy, wait until you hear about number 12, miracle fruit. This small red berry doesn't taste like much on its own, but eat one, then bite into a lemon, and it tastes like lemonade. It contains a protein called miraculin. It binds to receptors on your tongue and flips sour to sweet for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. The compound was first isolated by a Japanese researcher in 1968. It's now being seriously studied as a food and beverage sweetener. Here's why almost nobody has tried the actual fresh berry. Once picked, it deteriorates fast, which means it doesn't travel, which means most people who've encountered miraculin at all have only ever had it in freeze-dried tablet form, a pale substitute for the real thing. Ackee is Jamaica's national fruit. Cooked right, it's a staple, usually paired with saltfish, but this one comes with a real warning. Unripe ackee contains a toxin that can trigger a severe illness called Jamaican vomiting sickness. The fruit is only safe after it has ripened and opened naturally on the tree. Pick it early, you're in trouble. That single rule is why ackee carries import restrictions in multiple countries. It's not a mysterious ban. It's a hard food safety line, and growers take it seriously. Durian. If you've spent time in Southeast Asia, you already know durian. They call it the king of fruits there. But here's what makes it relevant to this list. Durian trees need consistent tropical heat, specific humidity, and precise soil and rainfall conditions. Get it right, and premium varieties sell for over $100 per fruit in Asian markets. Get it wrong, and you have nothing. The smell is legendary enough that it's been banned from hotels, airports, and public transit systems across the region. Not a myth, an actual posted rule. That's a fruit with a cultural footprint most Western growers will never come close to replicating. Rambutan. Rambutan is closely related to lychee and longan. The name comes from the Malay word for hair, which makes sense the second you see one. The tree itself isn't the problem. The fruit is. Once picked, rambutan degrades fast. It can't survive long shipping routes in good condition, which is exactly why it rarely makes it onto Western grocery shelves intact. Another fruit that's abundant at the source and almost invisible everywhere else. Buddha's hand. This is a citrus fruit shaped like a hand with long, curling fingers, and there's almost nothing inside it. No pulp, no juice, almost entirely rind and pith. What it does have is an intense lemony fragrance, which is why chefs and specialty growers prize it as an ingredient rather than something anyone actually eats whole. It's grown by a small number of specialty producers and stays firmly in niche territory everywhere else. Feijoa. This one goes by two names, Feijoa or pineapple guava. Either way, most people outside a handful of countries have never encountered it, and there's a reason for that. The tree is genuinely difficult to cultivate well. It doesn't ripen evenly. You can have fruit ready to pick on one branch while the same tree is weeks away from ripening on another. That alone makes commercial growing a headache. But the bigger problem is what happens after harvest. Feijoa bruises so easily it barely survives being handled, let alone shipped across a country. New Zealand has a strong Feijoa culture. It's one of those fruits that shows up in people's backyards, gets dropped off at neighbors' doors in season, turns up in everything from yogurt to jam. But step outside that culture, and it's almost completely invisible. Not because it's impossible to grow, but because it refuses to behave like a commercial crop. If you've never tasted one, the flavor sits somewhere between guava, pineapple, and mint, with a jelly-like center that softens as it ripens. It's the kind of fruit that makes you wonder why nobody has figured out how to get it to market properly. The answer, every time, is that bruise. Cupuaçu is what you get if cacao had a larger, wilder cousin that never left the Amazon. The two plants are closely related, both in the Theobroma genus, and Cupuaçu grows wild across the rainforest floor, with some cultivation in parts of Peru and northern Brazil. The fruit itself is large, up to 8 inches long, with a thick woody shell and a white, creamy pulp that smells like a cross between chocolate and tropical fruit. In Brazil, that pulp is everywhere. Juices, ice cream, desserts, a chocolate-like product called cupulate that some producers have been pushing as an alternative to conventional chocolate. Outside the Amazon basin, almost nobody has heard of it. Part of that is geography. The tree is adapted to specific rainforest conditions, high humidity, consistent warmth, rich Amazonian soil that are genuinely hard to replicate in cultivation elsewhere. Part of it is infrastructure. Getting fresh Cupuaçu pulp out of the Amazon and into an international market in good condition is a logistical challenge that most producers haven't solved at scale. The result is a fruit with serious commercial potential that remains, for now, almost entirely invisible to the rest of the world. Langsat grows in dense clusters on tall tropical trees across Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. Peel back the thin, papery skin, and you get small, translucent segments with a flavor that sits somewhere between a mild grapefruit and a grape. Sweet, tart, clean. It's intensely seasonal. When Langsat is in season in the right place, it's everywhere. Market stalls, roadside vendors, piled high in baskets. Then it's gone. That disappearing act isn't just about seasons. It's about shelf life. Langsat deteriorates fast after harvest, which means it has the same problem that keeps showing up on this list. A fruit that's genuinely delicious, genuinely abundant where it grows, and almost completely unknown everywhere else. Not because it's rare, because it refuses to travel. What makes Langsat slightly different is the skin. On some varieties, the milky sap in the rind can cause mild irritation if it gets on your lips. Nothing severe, but enough that first timers picking their way through a cluster sometimes notice it. It's a small thing, but it's the kind of detail that reminds you these fruits exist in a world that hasn't been optimized for export. They're built for where they come from. Mangaba. Mangaba doesn't have a global profile. It doesn't have a trending moment. It's just a fruit that communities in Brazil's Cerrado and coastal regions have been harvesting for generations, quietly, locally, without much attention from the outside world. The fruit itself is small, plum-sized, with a creamy, tangy flesh that's intensely perfumed when fully ripe. And that's exactly when the problem starts. The moment Mangaba reaches peak ripeness, it's already on borrowed time. It bruises at a touch. It won't survive being packed into a crate. It certainly won't survive a shipping container. What that means in practice is that Mangaba stays where it grows. It's a regional food consumed close to the tree, preserved in local recipes, juices, ice creams, jams, and almost entirely unknown beyond the communities that grow it. There's no export market because there's no way to build one without the fruit falling apart in the process. It's one of the clearest examples on this list of a fruit that isn't rare because of anything dramatic. No legal ban, no impossible growing conditions, no 30-year wait. It's rare everywhere else simply because it's too fragile to leave home. Australian finger lime. Most citrus fruits work the same way inside. Segments, pulp, juice. You know what you're getting. Finger lime breaks every rule. Slice one open, and instead of pulp, you get hundreds of tiny round vesicles that roll out like pearls. Each one holds a burst of citrus juice. Tart, bright, intensely flavored. Chefs started calling them citrus caviar, and the name stuck because there's genuinely nothing else like it in the citrus family. The finger lime is native to the subtropical rainforests of southeastern Queensland and northern New South Wales in Australia, a specific, narrow band of habitat it evolved in over millions of years. It grows on a thorny, slow-maturing shrub that takes years to produce meaningful fruit and doesn't respond well to being pushed into fast commercial production. That combination, unique habitat, slow growth, fragile fruit, and a flavor profile that was completely unknown outside Australia until relatively recently, kept it off the radar for most of the world for a long time. It's only in the last decade or so that specialty citrus growers in places like Florida and California have started cultivating it seriously. And even now, it remains expensive, limited in supply, and largely absent from mainstream markets. If you ever see one at a farmer's market or specialty grocer, buy it. Slice it open at the table. It's one of those fruits that genuinely surprises people who think they've seen everything citrus can do. Horned melon. This one looks like it was designed by someone who had never seen a fruit before. The outside is a hard, spiky shell, the color of a traffic cone. Crack it open and the inside is bright green, jelly-like, packed with soft seeds surrounded by translucent flesh. The flavor lands somewhere between banana, lime, and cucumber, which sounds like it shouldn't work and somehow does. Kiwano is native to the Kalahari Desert region of sub-Saharan Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, where it evolved to thrive in arid conditions that would kill most fruiting crops. That drought tolerance is actually one of its more interesting traits. It can survive on minimal water and still produce fruit, which has made it a subject of interest for researchers looking at food security in dry climates. Despite that, it hasn't broken into mainstream agriculture anywhere outside its native range in any serious way. Part of the reason is the eating experience. The jelly interior and seed-heavy flesh aren't what most Western consumers expect from a fruit, and that unfamiliarity has slowed adoption. Part of it is simply that it occupies a niche, visually striking enough to turn up in food styling and high-end restaurant plating, but not quite practical enough as an everyday crop. It does show up in specialty stores in Europe and North America with some regularity, more than most fruits on this list. But growing it well and growing it at a scale that makes commercial sense remains a challenge most producers haven't taken on seriously. Salak. The first thing most people notice about salak isn't the fruit. It's the palm it grows on. Lodoicea maldivica, this is not. Salak comes from a stemless, clumping palm called Salaka zalaka, and it is covered in some of the sharpest, densest spines of any cultivated plant you'll ever encounter. In parts of Indonesia and Malaysia, farmers plant it along property boundaries specifically because nothing is getting through it. It's a fruit tree that doubles as a weapon. Peel back that scaly reddish-brown skin, which is exactly where the snake fruit name comes from, and the inside is completely different. Crisp, apple-like segments with a flavor that's sweet, acidic, and slightly astringent all at once. Some varieties lean drier and crunchier. Others are juicier and more intensely sweet. The range across cultivars is wider than most people expect from a fruit they've never heard of. Salak is one of Indonesia's most important fruit crops. It's grown seriously and at scale in Java and Bali, with dedicated cultivation regions and distinct local varieties that are treated with the same regional pride you'd associate with wine appellations in Europe. Bali Salak, for instance, is considered a premium variety and is sought after across the Indonesian archipelago. Outside Southeast Asia, though, it's almost invisible. The fruit travels reasonably well compared to some others on this list, better than Jabuticaba, better than Mangaba, but it hasn't broken into Western markets in any meaningful way. Part of that is unfamiliarity. Part of it is the texture, which takes some adjustment if you're expecting something soft and juicy. And part of it is simply that the global fruit trade hasn't prioritized it when there are easier crops to move. If you ever get the chance to handle a Salak palm, wear gloves. If you ever get the chance to eat a Salak fruit, don't hesitate. Cherimoya Mark Twain called Cherimoya the most delicious fruit known to men. That's not a modern food writer being hyperbolic. That's an 1866 travel diary entry from someone who encountered it in Hawaii and felt strongly enough to write it down. So why haven't you heard of it? Cherimoya is native to the cool mountain valleys of the Andes, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and it needs a very specific climate to thrive. Not tropical heat, not cold winters. A narrow band of altitude and temperature that exists in surprisingly few places on Earth. It grows well in parts of California, Spain, and Chile. But the moment you move outside those conditions, the tree struggles and the fruit quality drops off sharply. The flesh is unlike almost anything else in the fruit world. Custard-like, smooth, with no fibrous texture, and the flavor is a layered combination that people consistently describe as banana, pineapple, and strawberry happening at the same time. There's a reason Twain's description has been quoted for over a century. It's not an exaggeration. The seeds are worth knowing about. Cherimoya seeds are toxic if crushed, which occasionally comes up in food safety discussions, but presents no real issue for anyone eating the fruit normally and simply avoiding the seeds. What keeps Cherimoya off mainstream shelves is a combination of that narrow climate window, a relatively short shelf life once picked, and the fact that pollination in cultivation is often done by hand. The natural pollinators don't exist in most places where the tree is grown commercially. Hand pollination at scale is labor intensive, and that cost shows up in the price. In a California farmer's market, a single cherimoya can run you $8 to $12 for a fruit most shoppers walk past because they don't recognize it. Mamey sapote. Mamey sapote is one of those fruits that sits at the center of an entire food culture and barely exists outside of it. Across Cuba, Mexico, Guatemala, and much of the Caribbean, mamey is a serious crop, eaten fresh, blended into milkshakes, churned into ice cream, and used in a range of desserts that vary by country and region. In Miami's Cuban and Caribbean communities, mamey milkshakes are as ordinary as a strawberry smoothie anywhere else. The fruit has deep cultural roots and a loyal following wherever it grows. Step outside that geography and almost nobody has heard of it. The fruit itself is large, often the size of a small football, with a rough brown skin that gives no indication of what's inside. Cut it open and you get dense, salmon orange flesh with a flavor that's genuinely hard to place. Sweet and rich, with notes that people variously compare to pumpkin, sweet potato, almond, and honey all at once. The texture is smooth and almost custardy, similar to cherimoya but denser. The tree needs sustained tropical warmth and a long growing season. It's not going to survive in a climate that gets cold winters, and it takes years to come into productive bearing. South Florida is about as far north as commercial mamey cultivation makes sense in the United States. And even there, it remains a specialty crop serving specific communities rather than a mainstream grocery item. What's interesting about mamey is that the barrier isn't really agricultural. The tree grows well where conditions are right. The fruit tastes extraordinary to almost everyone who tries it. The demand exists in communities that know it. What's missing is the infrastructure and the mainstream market awareness to push it beyond the regions where it already belongs. It's less a fruit that can't travel and more a fruit that nobody has invested in teaching the rest of the world about yet. Red Love apple, every apple you've ever eaten has been white inside or close to it. The skin might be red, green, yellow, but slice one open and the flesh is pale. That's just what apples are. Red Love breaks that assumption completely. These were developed by Swiss fruit breeder Marcus Kobelt over more than 2 decades of selective breeding. Not genetic modification, straight selective breeding, specifically to produce an apple with vivid red flesh all the way through. The result isn't just visually striking. The flavor is genuinely different from a standard apple. Tart, complex, with a berry-like edge that most people don't expect the first time they try one. The breeding program started in the 1990s, and the first Red Love varieties weren't commercially released until around 2010. That's 20 plus years of work to produce something that looks on the surface like it should have existed already. It hadn't, because getting red pigmentation, specifically anthocyanins, distributed evenly through apple flesh rather than just concentrated in the skin, is genuinely difficult to achieve through breeding alone. What keeps Red Love off standard grocery shelves isn't taste or growing difficulty. The trees perform reasonably well in temperate climates where regular apples thrive. The issue is scale. Cultivation rights are licensed to a limited number of orchards across Europe and North America, and production volumes are still a fraction of what mainstream commercial varieties achieve. It's less a rare fruit and more a fruit in the early stages of finding its market. But for most growers and consumers right now, it might as well be invisible. The red flesh also has a practical upside that standard apples don't. It doesn't brown after being cut. Slice a red love apple, leave it on a board, and the flesh stays vivid. For food presentation, that's a genuinely useful property, and it's one reason chefs and specialty food producers have taken notice even while mainstream retail hasn't caught up yet. Dekopon Japan takes mandarin cultivation seriously in a way that most of the world doesn't. Dekopon is the clearest example of what that looks like at its peak. Developed in Japan in the late 1970s by crossing a Kiyomi orange with a Ponkan mandarin, it wasn't commercially released until 1991, over a decade of development before anyone outside the breeding program got to taste one. That kind of patience is built into how Japan approaches premium fruit production, and it shows in the result. The flavor is exceptional, intensely sweet, almost no acidity, with juice that fills the segment so completely that biting into one feels more like drinking than eating. The rind peels easily, there are no seeds, and the segments separate cleanly. It's engineered for the eating experience in a way that most fruit simply isn't. The distinctive knob at the top, the bump that gives Decopon its visual identity, is a byproduct of the variety's genetics, not something breeders selected for intentionally. It became iconic anyway. Grown primarily in Kumamoto Prefecture, Dekopon has strict quality standards attached to its name in Japan. Minimum sugar content, maximum acidity levels, size requirements. Fruit that doesn't meet those standards can't carry the Dekopon name. That quality control is part of why it commands premium prices and why Japanese consumers treat it as a seasonal luxury, rather than an everyday citrus. Outside Japan, it's grown under different names. Sumo citrus in the United States, where California cultivation has expanded significantly in recent years. But even with that growth, supply is limited. The season is short, roughly late winter to early spring, and the price remains well above standard Mandarin territory. A single Decopon in a Japanese department store gift box can cost more than a full bag of clementines anywhere else. What Decopon represents, more than anything on this list, is what fruit can become when an entire agricultural culture decides that flavor and experience matter more than yield and shelf life. Most of the global fruit industry optimizes for the opposite. Decopon is what you get when someone refuses to. Genip, Mamoncillo genip, is the kind of fruit that tells you everything about how food culture works and how invisible it can be from the outside. Across Puerto Rico, Cuba, Colombia, Venezuela, and much of the Caribbean coast of Central America, Genip is a completely ordinary fruit. It grows on large, spreading trees that shade streets and yards. In season, Typically summer, it shows up everywhere. Street vendors sell it in clusters. Kids crack them open on the way home from school. It's a snack food, a seasonal ritual, a thing that marks the time of year the way strawberries do in England or peaches do in Georgia. The fruit itself is small, roughly the size of a large grape, with a thin green shell you crack between your teeth or split with your thumbnail to get to the pulp inside. That pulp is a thin layer of tangy, slightly sweet flesh wrapped around a single large seed. The flavor is tart and refreshing, somewhere between lime and lychee, with a slight astringency that keeps it from being cloying. You eat them in handfuls, spitting the seeds as you go. Outside the Caribbean and northern South America, almost nobody has encountered one. Not because Genip is difficult to grow. The tree is actually quite robust, tolerates drought reasonably well, and produces abundantly in the right climate. Not because of import restrictions or a fragility problem. Simply because no one has ever built the infrastructure to move it into mainstream markets, and the communities that grow it haven't needed them to. It's the last fruit on this list, and in some ways, it's the most honest one. No dramatic backstory, no legal history, no 30-year wait, just a fruit that's been sitting in plain sight for centuries, feeding communities across an entire region while the rest of the world looked the other way. That's how most of the fruits on this list actually work. They're not hidden. They're just not where you've been looking. 20 fruits. And the pattern running through almost all of them is the same. It's rarely that these plants are impossible to grow. It's not usually that they're toxic or illegal or locked behind some impossible climate. Most of them grow abundantly somewhere. Most of them feed entire communities who have never once thought of them as rare or exotic, because to those communities, they're just Tuesday. The plants that make it into your grocery store aren't the best tasting ones. They're not the most nutritious ones. They're not the ones that took decades of careful breeding or centuries of cultivation knowledge to perfect. They're the ones tough enough to survive a truck. The ones that can sit in a shipping container for 2 weeks and still look acceptable under fluorescent lights. The ones that bruise least last longest and photograph well enough to move units. That's the filter the global fruit trade runs on. And almost everything on this list failed it. Not because the fruit wasn't good enough, but because the system wasn't built for it. What that means for you as someone who grows things or wants to is that the most interesting fruit in the world is almost never going to find you. You have to go looking. A farmer's market in the right city at the right time of year. A specialty grocer serving a community that knows what it's buying. A tree in someone's backyard that they're happy to let you try. A seed from a supplier who's spent years figuring out which varieties will actually produce in your climate. The list we went through today is 20 fruits. There are thousands more operating by the same logic, abundant somewhere, invisible everywhere else, sitting outside the supply chain waiting for someone to care enough to find them. If you've grown or tasted any of the ones on this list, I want to know in the comments. And if there's a fruit from your region that belongs on a list like this, something your neighbors take for granted that the rest of the world has never heard of, put that in there too. Hit subscribe before you go. There's a lot more where this came from.